everyone, it's George Belville here with the Head for Home team at the KW Collective. I wanted to make this video to talk about commissions, realtor payment, how we started, where we are now, and how that impacts buyers and sellers. So very quickly, I just want to go back to the history of this. So back in the old days when realtors first started being a profession, if someone wanted to sell their house, they would find an agent. They would say, if you can sell our house, we will compensate you. And for discussion purposes, we're going to say they were compensated with one apple pie because we're not allowed to talk about commissions. So they could hire somebody, the agent would sell their house if they found the buyer, and then the agent would get the apple pie. And agents quickly figured out that if they told their friends about this house and other people in their office and were willing to share the pie, then those agents would bring buyers, the house would be sold, and the two agents would split the pie. Went like that for a long time. And in that scenario, everyone involved worked for the seller. So the seller would hire somebody, that agent would find another agent to help sell the house, but in that process, everyone worked for the seller. And this went along for years, and it developed from word of mouth to books in the office listing all the houses and what the compensation was. And then the offices getting together and having one big book that had all the houses that were listed for sale and what the compensation and the details were. And that eventually became the MLS system, which made it electronic, but it was still the same thing. Sellers hiring an agent, paying that agent, and that agent offering to share the compensation with other agents. So it went like that for years and years up until the 90s, when finally people realized, hey, some of these buyers are actually being taken advantage of because they're telling their financial situation, if they have a house to sell, their motivation, the pressure, their life story, hopes and dreams, all of that, they're telling it to their agent. That agent is working for the seller, and they're passing the information to the seller. And even contractually, some people were being taken advantage of because in the end, everyone worked for the seller. So they created buyer agency to solve that. And what that meant is that buyers can hire their own agent to help them, represent them, negotiate for them, and negotiate on their behalf, not in what's in the best interest of the seller. But the compensation model stayed the same because it was in the MLS, it was very transparent and efficient, and it worked pretty well. So the agent or the seller would still hire someone, they'd offer commission to that person, and if that person agent got another agent to bring the buyer, they would share the commission. So eventually, some sellers started to say, wait a minute, why are we paying someone to negotiate against us and work for this buyer that could potentially hurt us in the sale? So that has been a sticking point for a while. The other side of this coin is that the information was sold by the MLSs to Zillow and other online formats, and that took the information out of the MLS, and the MLS and the agents lost control of their data. So now it's much more of a commodity as opposed to a commission sharing arrangement. So once the buyer agency was created and this conflict began where the sellers were saying, wait a minute, why am I paying someone to negotiate against me? And they were feeling like they were being forced to compensate the buyer agent, when in fact, contracts are always negotiable, commissions are negotiable, but eventually it led to a lawsuit, and the lawsuit said that the sellers were harmed by being forced to pay buyer agent compensation. And what was never factored into that lawsuit was the fact that if they hadn't offered buyer agent compensation and been in the MLS, they probably would have sold for less. And many of them probably netted more money by offering to pay the buyer agent. And it seems a little counterintuitive at first. You know, why would you want a buyer agent negotiating against the seller? But they're not just negotiating against them. You know, to consummate a transaction, you need a ready, willing, and able buyer. And a good, experienced, quality buyer agent, that's what they bring you. They're not out there running around with people who don't have any money, who don't know what they want, who can't make a decision, who shouldn't be buying a house to begin with. So in my case, I love working with an experienced buyer agent who's bringing good advice, you know, dealing with buyer's remorse and all the things, and making sure that they're making a solid, well-informed decision and moving forward with the home purchase that they are qualified for. It's kind of the best of both worlds. So there was a lawsuit last year, and it kind of changed all of this. So what I'd like to do now is talk to you about where we are in the current commission environment. So the current commission environment is a little bit different. We used to be able to put buyer agent compensation in the multiple listing service, and now we're not allowed to do that. So a seller can decide, and they've always been able to do this, but it's built into the contracts a little bit more now to make it more specific, and so they better understand it. So when a seller is selling their house, they can negotiate the compensation that they're paying the agent who's selling the house for them, and then they can choose to offer compensation to a buyer agent. They can choose to not offer compensation to a buyer agent, or they can do it on a case-by-case basis, and if the buyer agent asks for, or the buyer includes the seller paying buyer agent compensation in their offer, the seller can consider it at that time. So it's less transparent and less efficient now, but it's more precise, and I guess maybe that's the one good thing that came out of this. So what happens now is when the seller's sitting down with their agent to do the paperwork, they're deciding this up front. Are they going to offer compensation to the buyer agent or not? So, and it seems like a savings to the seller when they don't offer it, but there's something everyone needs to remember, and that's the buyers pay for everything. So whatever compensation is occurring, it is because of the payment that the buyer is making to the seller. So without that, nothing happens and no one gets paid. So there are two sides to that really that people need to think about. So it might seem like a savings side on the real estate fee, but you may net less money because the offer that you get from the buyer may not be as strong. And there are really two reasons for that. The first one is, and the example we like to use, and again, there's no fixed commissions, but just to make the math easier, the example we use is a $600,000 house, 3% commission to the listing agent, 3% commission to the buyer agent. If the seller isn't offering that compensation, then the buyer has to come up with $18,000 more to buy the house. So they have their down payment, closing costs, all of those things. By not offering the compensation, the buyer now needs to get $18,000 more, and it has to be cash. It can no longer be rolled into the purchase price. The old way, the purchase price, the commission, could be rolled into the total purchase price, so the down payment didn't change. So now we're adding $18,000 to the buyer's cost. So that's an expense to them. And if you're a buyer and you're looking at two houses, and one is not offering buyer agent compensation and one is, the one who isn't offering it basically costs $18,000 more than the one who is, and it's $18,000 cash. So if they're comparing two houses and one is offering it and one is not, one is going to be relatively more expensive to them. So they'll probably make a lower offer. And the second part of it, which I think doesn't get enough discussion, is a confident buyer who knows the situation and has as much information as they can is going to make a stronger offer than a buyer who doesn't. So the way it is now, the buyer may not know if the seller is offering compensation, or if they say, submit your offer and we'll consider it. So what that means is, as the buyer is preparing their offer, they have to wonder if the seller is going to cover that buyer agent compensation. So if they're wondering about that, they're going to make a less strong offer, because they have to make an offer knowing that there's a chance they might need to come up with another $18,000. And that affects how they see things. So again, it's up to all the parties involved to decide what they're going to do. And some buyers might just say, you know what, we're going to pay our buyer agent. We know the cost up front. We're willing to do it. It's not an issue for them. But those people are few and far between, because the fact that that needs to be cash brought to closing and then added to their down payment and closing costs is going to affect, I would say, probably 90% of buyers at least. So that's where we are. So if you're watching this as a seller, what that means to you is you have to decide, do you want to just say, no, we're not offering it, and there's a chance you could get lower offers and less qualified buyer agents who are willing to work for less, who are writing offers that might not succeed. There's risk to everything. Or do you want to just offer it so the buyer has a firm picture of what the scenario is so they can write their best offer? Or do you want to do it on a case-by-case basis? And there are pros and cons to all of them. My personal opinion is it's in the best interest of the seller to offer the buyer agent compensation, because that provides information to the buyer that will allow them to make a strong, clean offer. And this lawsuit that came out, all of this has happened during a 10 or 15 year seller market, which is not normally the case, because the flip side of this is going to be when the market is down and sellers can't sell their houses, they're not going to be able to offer any compensation to buyer's agents. They're not going to be able to advertise it. They're going to have to wait until someone is showing the house and then tell them about any compensation or bonuses or things like that, because there used to be a lot of things that people would bonus agents to get them to show the houses as an incentive. So it's a little bit confusing, but I wanted to touch on that. Hopefully that makes sense. And if you have any questions, obviously, or specific scenarios you'd like to talk about, our contact information is somewhere below or above here. And if you have any questions, let us know. Hope you have a great day.